Rude Talk Show confronts Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, but them response leaves the audience spee. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were no strangers to the spotlight. Both actors had been around for years, but their shared history and on-screen chemistry in the 1994 action thriller Speed had solidified them as one of Hollywood's most beloved pairs. It wasn't just their characters' relationship that fans adored. It was the undeniable bond between them that felt so genuine. Over the years, they had maintained a friendship that kept them in the public eye, even though both had taken on different roles in their respective careers. Sandra had blossomed into a multifaceted actress with notable roles in The Proposal and Gravity, while Keanu had shown incredible range in everything from action films like The Matrix to more heartfelt performances in John Wick. The stage was set for a truly memorable moment when they were invited to appear on a popular late-night talk show together. The host, known for being bold and often pushing boundaries with his questions, was eager to have the two reunited on his set. The show had a reputation for creating moments that people would talk about long after the episode aired. With Keanu and Sandra sitting together on the couch, the audience buzzed with excitement, waiting to see what would unfold. Everyone knew this wasn't just any interview. It was the reunion of two beloved stars who had worked together on a groundbreaking film, and everyone was eager to hear about their time on Speed and their experiences since. The moment the cameras rolled, the host wasted no time in diving into the conversation. He was known for his bluntness, asking questions that were sometimes more personal than professional. The audience was familiar with his style, but even they weren't fully prepared for what was about to unfold. As Keanu and Sandra exchanged smiles and small talk, the host leaned forward and asked a seemingly innocent question, but one that had the potential to make things awkward. "So Speed was a huge success, and I'm sure you both knew it would be, right?" he began, looking directly at them. Keanu, always calm, simply nodded, giving a quiet smile. Sandra responded with her usual charm, recalling the adrenaline rush of working on the film. The host then steered the conversation into more personal territory, pressing Keanu and Sandra on their relationship during the making of the movie. He asked, "There were rumors back then about the tension on set. Was there any truth to that? Were things a little rocky between you two?" The question was out of place. It wasn't about the movie or their shared experiences on set. It was digging into something private. But it was exactly the type of question the host loved asking. He didn't want a safe, predictable answer. He wanted something that would make headlines. Keanu's face remained expressionless, and Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing together as she considered how to respond. Keanu, ever composed, simply shrugged. "There's always pressure on set. We had a job to do, and we did it," he said in his usual understated manner. He wasn't going to play into the drama the host was trying to create. Sandra, on the other hand, wasn't going to let the host's question slide so easily. She leaned forward, a smile playing on her lips, but there was an edge to her tone. "I think we both know that any film set has its challenges," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But the rumors, honestly, they're just that, rumors. It was a great experience, and we got through it together. End of story." The host, undeterred, pressed on. "But don't you think it would be a bit of an exaggeration to say there was no tension at all? You two were very different personalities. Wouldn't that have created some friction behind the scenes?" The room went silent for a moment. The audience waited, unsure of how the actors would respond. Sandra's smile faded, and her eyes locked with the host's. "You know, it's interesting," she began, her tone now more serious. "People love to talk about tension, drama, and conflict, but that's not always the reality. It's just easier for people to imagine these things than to understand that two people can work well together without it being some epic battle. It's a shame, really." Keanu added, "Yeah, there's a lot of focus on the negative. People want stories with conflict because they're more interesting. But we worked hard, had fun, and made a great film. That's what I choose to remember." The host's smile faltered just for a moment. He wasn't getting the response he had hoped for. But he wasn't going to back down. All right, he said, chuckling lightly to mask the tension in the room. "Let's move on to something else then. Sandra, Keanu, there were also rumors about the two of you. Well, not rumors exactly, but the chemistry that was so visible on screen. A lot of people wondered if there was something more between you two. Was there ever a time where you thought, Maybe we could be more than just co-stars? The question was out there, and the host seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort that was beginning to settle. It wasn't as if Sandra and Keanu hadn't heard these questions before. The media had loved speculating about their relationship, especially after the success of Speed. Fans had wondered if there had been more to their connection, something deeper than just professional respect. It wasn't the first time they'd been asked about it, but now, with the focus entirely on them, it felt like the host was pushing them into an uncomfortable corner. Sandra glanced at Keanu, a small, knowing smile appearing on her face. "You know, I think we've both been asked that question 100 times," she said, looking at Keanu before turning back to the host. "But here's the thing. People love to romanticize friendships. They love to imagine something more, but sometimes people just work well together. And sometimes there's no deeper reason for it." Keanu nodded, agreeing with Sandra's sentiments. "Exactly," he added quietly. "I think sometimes people just need to understand that two people can have a connection without there needing to be a hidden agenda or any underlying tension." The host seemed to understand that his line of questioning wasn't working, but he pressed on, clearly determined to create a moment. "So, no sparks flew? Not even a little?" Keanu's eyes twinkled for a brief second, and then he smiled. "No sparks, no fire," he said, his tone as calm as ever, almost amused by the host's persistence. Sandra let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I think Keanu summed it up pretty well." The conversation moved on from there, with the host trying to steer things into more typical talk show fare, but the damage had already been done. The uncomfortable tension that had built up between the host's intrusive questions and the actor's calm, measured responses was palpable. The audience, sensing the shift in energy, grew quiet, their reactions mixed. At this point, the show had already taken a strange turn. The host, once brimming with confidence, seemed a bit off his game. Keanu and Sandra had shown no signs of being rattled by his probing questions, and their answers had not only shut down the uncomfortable topic, but also left the audience in awe of their composure. The early moments of the interview, filled with the host's uncomfortable questions, had not only failed to create the drama he had hoped for, but had also showcased the remarkable friendship and respect between Keanu and Sandra. The interview had started with tension, but as it went on, the two stars had turned the conversation in a direction that was thoughtful, dignified, and respectful. The audience may have come expecting a clash, but what they got was something far more powerful: two actors who were in control of their own narrative. As the interview progressed, the atmosphere in the studio began to shift. The initial tension, which had been sparked by the host's provocative questions, started to dissipate. Keanu and Sandra's composed and gracious responses had not only diffused the awkwardness, but had also brought a certain sense of calm to the room. However, the host, determined to push for something more, wasn't quite ready to let go of the confrontational tone. He could feel the crowd's attention slipping away, and he needed to reclaim it. He needed to stir things up, to spark a reaction from his guests. The audience, sensing this change, sat in rapt attention, eagerly awaiting what would happen next. Would the host continue to provoke, or would the stars maintain their calm demeanor and steer the conversation in a more positive direction? The air was thick with curiosity. The host, trying to regain control, leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Sandra first. "So, Sandra," he began with a slightly more playful tone, "you've been in the industry for years. You've played so many diverse characters, from the romantic lead in While You Were Sleeping to the intense survivalist in Gravity. I'm curious, though, what's been the hardest role for you? What has truly tested you as an actor?" Sandra, who had been relaxed in her chair, straightened up a little at the change in tone. She wasn't about to let the host off the hook, but she also wasn't going to make it easy for him. She leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful as she processed the question. "Honestly, I think the most difficult role for me wasn't about how intense the character was," she began, her voice steady. "It was about the emotional challenges. When I was doing Gravity, I spent so much time alone in front of a green screen, pretending to be floating in space, and the physical demands were grueling. But what made it really tough was the emotional isolation of it. I had to dig deep into those feelings of loneliness and fear, and that's where it became really exhausting." Keanu, who had been quietly observing, nodded along. He had worked with Sandra on a variety of projects, but it was clear that he respected her ability to immerse herself fully into her roles. As Sandra spoke, Keanu glanced at her, then shifted his attention back to the host, a slight smile on his face. He wasn't a fan of discussing his own struggles or challenges, but he could appreciate when others did. The host, perhaps sensing the more reflective mood that had settled in, decided to ask Keanu a similar question. "Keanu," he began, his voice a bit softer now, "you've had an interesting career. From The Matrix to John Wick, you've played a variety of characters who are often strong, silent, and intense. But I imagine those roles come with their own kind of pressure. What do you find to be the hardest part of playing those kinds of characters?" Keanu's expression didn't change much, but there was a small, almost imperceptible pause before he answered. "It's funny," he said, his voice calm, "because I never really think about the pressure. I think the hardest part is trying to find something real in a character who doesn't speak much. It's easy to rely on dialogue to tell a story, but when you're playing someone like John Wick or Neo, you have to convey so much through silence and action. You have to make sure every movement counts. That's what I enjoy about those roles, the challenge of expressing everything without saying much." Sandra smiled softly as Keanu spoke. She had seen him navigate some of the most physically demanding roles with ease, but she knew just how much he put into making those silences meaningful. She didn't need to say much to express her admiration for his approach to acting. It was something she had always respected. But just as the interview seemed to find its rhythm, the host threw another curveball. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly as he addressed the two stars with a more direct tone. "All right," he said with a mischievous grin, "let's shift gears for a second. Everyone knows the two of you have great on-screen chemistry. But tell me, has there ever been a moment where you thought, 'This is it, we've nailed it, this scene is going to go down as one of the greats'?" Sandra raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift back to their previous work together on Speed. "You know, the chemistry thing is always funny," she said, half smiling. "People love to romanticize the idea of on-screen chemistry, but the reality is we just did our jobs. We trusted each other, we worked together, and it happened naturally. There wasn't any grand plan behind it." Keanu, who had been quiet for a moment, added his own thoughts. "Exactly," he said, his tone measured. "I think it's about trust and respect. When you have that between two people, it doesn't matter if you're on screen or off. It shows in the work and it's felt by the audience." The host, sensing that his attempts at stirring up drama were falling flat, shifted tactics once more. "So, let's talk about something else, something a little more recent," he said, his voice taking on a more playful tone. "You two seem to be in the middle of a cultural resurgence right now. John Wick, The Matrix, all of that. Is there a part of you that feels like you're stepping back into your roles with a fresh perspective? Or is it all just business as usual for you?" Sandra glanced at Keanu, her expression thoughtful. "I think for both of us, it's about being present. We don't necessarily have an agenda to resurrect something, but it's nice to see that people still care about those characters." "It's humbling, honestly," she said, her tone warm but genuine. "I think we're just grateful that people are still interested in what we're doing, and if we can give them something new, something fresh, that's great." Keanu nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's really about staying true to the characters," he said. "Whether it's Neo or John Wick, those characters are part of something bigger. But ultimately, we just focus on doing the work and doing it to the best of our abilities. The audience's response is always a bonus, but we can't let that affect the process." The host seemed to recognize that his attempt to stir up drama had failed yet again. Instead of focusing on the controversy he had hoped to create, Keanu and Sandra had expertly steered the conversation back to the heart of their work: humility, respect, and professionalism. The audience, who had been expecting more salacious details or juicy gossip, now found themselves captivated by the genuine connection between the two stars. They weren't just watching a talk show. They were witnessing the grace with which these two actors carried themselves in the face of intrusive questioning. There was a pause in the conversation, and the host, for the first time in the interview, seemed to relax. He sat back in his chair, a small, almost appreciative smile on his face. He had tried his best to push the buttons, but Keanu and Sandra had given nothing but respect and honesty in return. As the segment neared its end, the host couldn't help but admit defeat in his own way. "Well," he said, his tone lighter now, "I guess I'll have to try harder next time. You two have been surprisingly calm under all this pressure." He chuckled, but there was an underlying sincerity in his words. It was clear that, in his own way, he had come to respect how Keanu and Sandra had handled the interview. Keanu smiled softly, as if acknowledging the host's shift in tone. "Sometimes the best thing to do is just stay calm," he said quietly. Sandra nodded in agreement, her smile wide now. "Exactly. The world is loud enough as it is. No need to add to it." The host laughed, and the audience followed suit. It wasn't the reaction he had anticipated, but it was one that made the entire interview feel like a win for Keanu and Sandra. They hadn't just survived the host's uncomfortable questions. They had turned the conversation into something meaningful, something that resonated beyond the usual celebrity gossip. They had remained calm, composed, and in the end they had come out on top. As the interview continued, the atmosphere had dramatically shifted from one of tension to mutual respect. Keanu and Sandra, with their effortless charm and unwavering composure, had completely taken control of the conversation. The host, once eager to provoke a reaction from them, now found himself in uncharted waters. His usual techniques, designed to create a stir, had backfired. The audience, who had expected drama, had instead witnessed something far more powerful: grace under pressure. Now, as the conversation began to settle into a calmer rhythm, the host shifted his approach. He could see the energy in the room had changed, and the crowd was no longer hanging on to his every word. Instead, they were captivated by Keanu and Sandra's ability to remain grounded and unshaken. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to change direction entirely, move away from the personal questions and focus on the work that had brought them together. "So," the host began, his tone lighter now, "let's talk a little bit about your careers. You two have both been in the business for decades. That's not something many people can say. And yet, despite all the years, you both continue to bring something fresh to every project you take on. What do you think it is about your approach that keeps you both so relevant in an ever-changing industry?" Sandra's eyes lit up at the question. She wasn't one to shy away from discussing the craft of acting. "I think it's all about staying curious," she said, her voice confident but warm. "The industry changes, the world changes, but if you don't stay curious about what's out there, about what you're doing and why, then what's the point? I've always tried to challenge myself, to take on roles that scare me a little, that make me grow. I think that's how you stay relevant, by never resting on your laurels." Keanu nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful. "I agree with Sandra. But I also think it's about staying true to yourself. In this business, it's easy to get caught up in the expectations of others. But if you're not being authentic, if you're not doing the things that genuinely excite you, it's hard to connect with the audience. They can tell when you're faking it, so for me, I just try to stay true to the work that speaks to me." The host, now genuinely interested, leaned forward. "That's an interesting perspective. But when you're both so established, how do you decide which projects are worth your time? Is it the script, the director, the other actors? What's the deciding factor for you?" Sandra paused for a moment, clearly considering the question. "For me, it's a combination of things," she explained. "A great script is always the starting point, but I also look at the team behind it, the director, the producers, and the other actors. If I feel like I'm going to be in a space where I can collaborate and really create something special, then I'm in. It's not just about the role for me, it's about the experience. I want to be part of something that pushes me, something that challenges me to grow as an actor." Keanu nodded, clearly reflecting on his own experience. "For me, I think it's very similar. I've been fortunate to work with some amazing people over the years, and that's what makes a project exciting. Sure, the script matters, but it's also about the people you're working with. You have to trust them, and they have to trust you. When that happens, the work becomes much more than just a job. It becomes something you're all invested in, something you're all passionate about." The host, now thoroughly captivated by their insights, asked, "Do you think it's important to keep a sense of mystery in your career? You two have always been very private, and yet your fans seem to adore you both. Do you think that helps keep the magic alive?" Keanu was the first to respond, his voice calm but deliberate. "I think there's a certain magic in maintaining some privacy. I've always been someone who values my personal life and keeps it separate from my work. I think it's important to have a balance. The more you reveal, the more the public starts to expect from you, and I've never wanted to be defined by my personal life. I'd rather people appreciate my work and not feel like they know everything about me." Sandra smiled, nodding in agreement. I think there's something to be said for keeping some things to yourself. There's a lot of pressure to share everything, especially with social media these days. But I've always felt that my work should speak for itself. I want people to connect with my characters, not my Instagram feed. So yeah, I think a little bit of mystery is a good thing. The host, now more relaxed, gave a small laugh. It's interesting how different your approach is to the usual Hollywood trend, where everyone's constantly in the spotlight. You two have managed to keep a sense of mystery around you, and yet, people seem to adore you even more for it. Keanu shrugged, his expression as serene as ever. I think it's just about doing what feels right for you. I've never tried to fit into any mold, and I think that's what's helped me stay grounded. I do what I love, and that's enough for me. Sandra added, and I think people can tell when you're being authentic. They appreciate that. So I've always tried to stay true to myself and not get caught up in the circus that is Hollywood. I'd rather be known for the work I've done than for anything else. The host leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed by their answers. Well, I think that's something a lot of people could learn from. It's rare to hear such honesty, especially in an industry that can often feel so fake. Keanu smiled softly, his eyes twinkling with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It's just the way I've always approached it. I've been lucky enough to work with some great people, and I've learned that staying true to yourself is the best way to survive in this industry. Sandra agreed. Yeah, it's not about chasing fame or attention. It's about finding the work that speaks to you and doing it with integrity. That's what matters. The host, now with a more genuine sense of admiration, turned the conversation to a lighter note. You know, despite the challenges of the industry, it's clear that you two have managed to stay grounded and focused on what really matters. That's something that's pretty rare these days. Sandra smiled warmly. I think it's just about remembering where you came from. I've always tried to stay humble, no matter how much success I've had. It's easy to get caught up in the whirlwind, but I've always tried to remember that I'm just a person, just like everyone else. Keanu nodded. Yeah, I think staying grounded is important. The fame and the success can be fleeting, but the work you do and the people you connect with, those are the things that last. The host, clearly impressed, decided to end the segment on a positive note. Well, I think it's safe to say that you two are not only incredibly talented, but also incredibly humble. It's been a pleasure to have you both on the show tonight. I'm sure your fans appreciate hearing what you've had to say. And for those of us who didn't know much about your private lives, I think we've all learned a little something about the importance of staying true to yourself. Sandra and Keanu shared a knowing smile as the host concluded the segment. The audience, who had initially been waiting for gossip and scandal, now found themselves completely captivated by the thoughtful conversation. The dynamic between the two stars was undeniable, and their calm, grounded responses had not only won over the audience, but had also given them a new level of respect. As the show came to a close, the host thanked Keanu and Sandra for their time, and the two stars stood up to leave. The energy in the room was completely different from when they had first walked in. The audience had been expecting controversy, but instead, they had been treated to an interview filled with honesty, grace, and respect. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful response is simply to remain true to oneself. As the interview neared its final moments, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted dramatically. What had started as a tense, somewhat uncomfortable conversation had transformed into a genuine and meaningful exchange. The host, once focused on provoking drama, had found himself not only disarmed by the calm composure of Keanu and Sandra, but also in awe of their ability to remain poised in the face of challenging questions. The audience, who had expected scandal and gossip, had instead witnessed two stars handling the situation with grace and dignity, showing what true professionalism looked like. The host, now understanding that the typical talk show antics weren't going to work here, decided to wrap up the interview on a lighter note. He had spent most of the show trying to steer the conversation in controversial directions, but Keanu and Sandra had expertly kept things grounded and respectful. He had been trying to create a spectacle, but what he got was a lesson in how to handle the pressures of fame with humility and authenticity. As he looked at the two of them, he realized that this might be the most real conversation he had had with guests in a long time. Well, it's clear that you two have a lot of wisdom to share, not just about your careers, but about life in general, the host said, his tone lighter now. But before we go, let's have a little fun. You've both done some incredible work over the years, but if you could look back at one role that stands out as your absolute favorite, which one would it be? I know it's a tough question, but we're curious. Keanu smiled, a gentle laugh escaping him. It wasn't an easy question, but it was one that allowed him to reflect on his journey. It's always hard to pick a favorite, but I think The Matrix holds a special place for me. It wasn't just the role, it was everything that came with it. It changed the way people looked at action films, and it was a part of a cultural moment. That's something you don't often get to experience in your career. It was a film that challenged the boundaries of what was possible, and I think it had a lasting impact. Sandra nodded, reflecting for a moment. I get what you mean. For me, it would have to be The Proposal. It was such a fun experience, and I got to work with some incredible people. But also, I was able to play a character who was so different from me, and that was exciting. It's always fun to step into a role that challenges you, that makes you think in new ways. The host nodded, clearly impressed by their answers. It's interesting that both of you would mention roles that not only challenged you but also had a significant cultural impact. You both chose projects that were about pushing boundaries and doing something different. That's pretty remarkable. Keanu shrugged slightly, a modest expression on his face. It's not really about trying to be remarkable. It's just about finding the right stories to tell and the right people to tell them with. If you're lucky enough to be part of something that resonates with people, then that's the real reward. Sandra smiled, agreeing with Keanu's sentiment. Exactly. It's never about chasing the spotlight. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself. When you're lucky enough to do that, it feels like the work itself is the reward. The rest is just noise. The host, clearly taken aback by the sincerity of their responses, decided to shift the focus slightly. It's refreshing to hear both of you talk about your work in such a grounded way, he said. In an industry where so much attention is placed on fame and success, you two seem to have figured out what really matters. But what about the personal side of things? What's something you do outside of work that keeps you grounded, that reminds you who you really are? Sandra's eyes softened at the question. For me, it's always about staying connected to the people who matter most, she said, her voice calm and reflective. I think that's what keeps me grounded. I spend a lot of time with my family and close friends. I also love being outside. Nature has a way of reminding you how small you really are, and that perspective helps me stay focused on what truly matters. Keanu nodded in agreement. Yeah, I think it's the same for me. I like to spend time with the people I care about, and I also love spending time alone. Sometimes, just being able to clear your head and reset is important. I think it's easy to get lost in the hustle and bustle of the industry, but if you don't take a step back, you can lose sight of what's really important. The host smiled, clearly impressed by the depth of their answers. It's amazing how simple things, like spending time with loved ones and staying connected to nature, can help you stay grounded in such a crazy world. I think that's something we could all learn from. Sandra chuckled softly. I think we could all use a little more time away from our phones and social media. It's easy to get caught up in the noise, but it's important to take a step back and focus on what really matters, like real connections and the things that make you feel at peace. Keanu added, yeah, there's a lot of distractions out there. But I think if you can find that balance, if you can find those moments of peace, then you can navigate everything else much more easily. It's about knowing what you need and making sure you prioritize it. The host nodded thoughtfully. Well, I think you two are a great example of how to do just that, how to find balance in the midst of a chaotic industry. You've both managed to stay humble, stay grounded, and continue to create meaningful work, which is something a lot of people aspire to do. Keanu gave a small, appreciative smile. It's not always easy, but I think it's worth it. We're lucky to be doing something we love, and I try not to lose sight of that. Sandra smiled warmly, her eyes sparkling with genuine appreciation. I think that's the key to everything, really. If you love what you're doing and stay true to yourself, then the rest will follow. The fame, the success, it all becomes secondary to the work itself. As the interview drew to a close, the host, who had initially tried to provoke drama and controversy, was now in awe of the two stars in front of him. He had come into the interview hoping for a spectacle, something to grab headlines, but instead, he had gotten something far more profound, a glimpse into the hearts and minds of two people who had navigated the ups and downs of fame with grace, humility, and authenticity. Well, I think we can all agree that this has been one of the most refreshing interviews we've had in a long time, the host said, his voice sincere. Keanu, Sandra, thank you both so much for being here tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing your insights and learning from your experiences. You've reminded us all about the importance of staying true to ourselves and finding meaning in the work we do. Sandra and Keanu both smiled, exchanging a brief but meaningful glance before turning back to the host. Thank you for having us, Sandra said. It's been a pleasure. Keanu added, Yeah, thank you. It's been great to have a conversation that's about more than just the usual stuff. As the show wrapped up, the audience gave a standing ovation, their applause genuine and heartfelt. The hosts and crew members smiled, knowing that this interview had been different from all the others. It wasn't about scandal or gossip. It was about authenticity, kindness, and staying true to who you are. Keanu and Sandra had left a lasting impression, not just with their answers, but with the way they carried themselves. In a world where so many people sought attention and drama, they had proven that the most powerful thing you can do is simply be yourself. The final moments of the interview brought a surprising sense of calm and clarity. As the host wrapped up the conversation, there was an unmistakable shift in the room. What had started as a typical late-night talk show appearance had transformed into something much deeper. Keanu and Sandra had managed to steer the conversation in a way that left both the audience and the host reflecting on more than just celebrity gossip or sensational drama. What had stood out the most was their authenticity, their grounded approach to life and their careers, and the honesty with which they spoke about their experiences. As the applause for the interview began to die down, Keanu and Sandra exchanged a brief but knowing smile. It was a moment of silent acknowledgement, of the connection they shared and the quiet strength they each brought to the table. They had weathered the barrage of uncomfortable questions with grace, but now, as they prepared to leave, there was a sense of satisfaction in the air. They had come to the talk show as guests, but in many ways they had left as teachers, offering an unspoken lesson in humility and self-awareness. The host, who had spent the entire interview trying to provoke and spark a reaction, now found himself in a different mindset. He had gone into the conversation hoping for something controversial, something that would make headlines. Instead, he had been humbled by the two stars' calmness and their ability to turn an uncomfortable situation into a positive one. As they stood up from the couches and prepared to leave the stage, the host turned toward them one final time. Well, I have to say, the host began, his tone more sincere than before, this has been one of the most eye-opening interviews I've ever had. It's not every day you get to sit down with two people who have been through the highs and lows of the industry and come out of it with such a clear sense of self. You've given us all something to think about. Keanu and Sandra exchanged a glance before turning to the host. Sandra, ever the gracious one, spoke first. Thank you. It's been great to be here, and honestly, we appreciate the opportunity to talk about things that matter, not just the usual Hollywood fluff. Keanu, with his usual understated grace, nodded. Yeah, it's nice to have a conversation that's about more than just the surface level. The host smiled warmly, clearly moved by their words. It's a rare thing these days to see people who stay true to themselves in an industry that often pressures you to do the opposite. I think we've all learned something from your approach tonight. You've shown us that it's not about the fame or the attention. It's about the work you do and the person you remain while doing it. The words hung in the air, and for a moment the audience remained silent, absorbing the sentiment. The host had successfully wrapped up the interview, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be just another forgettable late-night segment. It would stick with the audience. It would stay in their minds, perhaps even long after the show had ended. As Keanu and Sandra made their way off the stage, they were met with applause from the audience. It wasn't just polite applause, it was genuine, heartfelt appreciation. They had entered the studio as the subjects of questions, but by the end of the night, they had flipped the script. The audience, who had been bracing for controversy, had been treated instead to an interview that was both refreshing and enlightening. It wasn't just about celebrity status. It was about how to navigate life with dignity, humility, and authenticity. It was a masterclass in composure. Backstage, as they were preparing to leave, Keanu and Sandra shared a quiet moment together. There was no need for words between them. They had both known what they had just experienced. The conversation had gone in directions neither of them had expected, but it had been exactly what was needed. They had each come into the show with a quiet sense of resolve, and they had left with their integrity intact, having stayed true to themselves throughout. As they stepped into the waiting car, Sandra let out a long sigh, a soft smile playing on her lips. "That was unexpected," she said with a laugh, still processing everything that had just happened. Keanu chuckled, his usual calm demeanor never wavering. "It was, but in a good way. It's nice to have a conversation that doesn't feel like an interrogation." Sandra nodded. "Yeah. It's easy to forget sometimes that we're just people, too. We get caught up in the roles we play, but tonight was a reminder of why we do this in the first place. It's about connecting with people through the work we do, not just the fame." Keanu looked out the window for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "I think that's what people appreciate. Not the gossip, not the drama, just the work. That's what stands the test of time." Sandra smiled, looking at him with a hint of admiration. "You're right. We all get caught up in the noise. But the truth is, it's about doing something meaningful and staying true to yourself." As they drove through the quiet streets, the city lights casting soft shadows on the ground, both Keanu and Sandra found themselves in a rare moment of reflection. They had been in the industry for decades, each of them having navigated their fair share of ups and downs, successes and setbacks. But in that moment, they realized that despite everything they had been through, they had managed to hold on to what mattered most: each other's friendship, their work, and their ability to stay true to themselves, no matter the external pressures. For Sandra, the night had been a reminder of the importance of being authentic, not just as an actor, but as a person. In a world that often rewarded superficiality, she knew that remaining grounded was the only way to live with peace. She thought about how she had come to realize that the work she did mattered far more than the attention that came with it. It wasn't the fame that defined her. It was her relationships, her choices, and her commitment to being genuine. Keanu, too, reflected on the interview. He had always been a private person, someone who shied away from the spotlight, but tonight had reminded him that it wasn't necessary to hide. His reputation as a humble, thoughtful actor was something he had worked hard to maintain, and the interview had only reinforced the value of being true to himself. He didn't need to seek validation from others. His work spoke for itself. As the car finally pulled up to their hotel, Sandra turned to Keanu, a grateful expression on her face. "Thanks for being a part of that tonight," she said quietly. "It's not easy to stay calm in those situations." Keanu shrugged, his modesty never far from the surface. "We made it through, and honestly, it's easier when you have someone like you by your side." They shared a brief but genuine smile, both knowing that their bond was something that couldn't be shaken, no matter what the world threw at them. As they entered the hotel, the night's events lingered in their minds. The interview had been an unexpected turn in their usual routines, but it had been a reminder of the things that truly mattered. They had walked into the studio as two stars, but they had left as two people who had shown the world what it meant to be authentic, to be humble, and to stay true to one's own values. And as the night came to a close, the world outside seemed just a little bit quieter, perhaps a little bit better, thanks to the example set by two stars who refused to let fame define them. Instead, they had defined themselves.